Hi, I'm Steelfur, and this is Steelfur Speaks, the Flesh and Blood talking podcast from the UK, where we cover all the latest news in the wonderful world of flesh and blood. It feels like it has been ages since I have recorded a main Steelfur Speaks episode. It was, we had all of the just fantastic worlds. There was loads of worlds content. I know loads of people wanted to talk about the DQs and things that happened at worlds. There was the video talking about the bribery DQ, which seems to have been resolved. It seems one of the players may have used language that kind of suggested that there was some, monetary exchange and result tied to it, and then it resulted in that player getting DQ'd. I don't know what's actually been admitted to LSS, but it seems like there were hints that the outcome of the game was impacted. It's just a reminder to everyone that when you're playing at that level, you really shouldn't be talking too much about prize splits or trying to, discuss the result of the game in any way other than playing it, because LSS are really strict about that. And even if the rules do say you can prize split, it does feel like those rules are more designed for further down the tournament structure. And at the highest level, LSS is going to be not particularly lenient with people discussing prize splits because they really want games to be played. The other discussion was about the fact that another player got DQ'd for looking around during a draft, which is obviously affects the integrity of the draft, but that player did have ADHD quite badly, so it does actually impact. There is actually a whole discussion that I thought it was worth having about what it feels like to play as someone who is more neurodiverse in this sort of setting, and what you can sort of do from your personal perspective, but also from a tournament perspective to help those people adjust. I am someone with neurodivergence myself, as I have dyspraxia, which is not, I would say, as tricky in those sorts of situations as ADHD is, though I do find it hard to do some actions consistently, like shuffling consistently in a way that has led me to friction with the Fab judge team in the past, who have thought from an outside observation perspective that my shuffling tactics have changed from pack to pack in a way that might imply that I was trying to ascertain something or make a different approach to shuffling to ascertain something about how my opponent was playing the game. So there is that factor just to be aware of. I think, they are getting very strict, as they probably should be at this level in tournaments, and those are reflected in the DQs we saw at Worlds. But I think there is an argument that more can be done. From the perspective of someone who's more neurodivergent, I think more steps can be made, both at the personal level and an overall organizational level, to let people know that it's okay to ask for help and that accommodations can be provided within reason, as long as they don't detract from the seriousness of the tournament. If the extent of what you need is a fidget spinner under the table or something just to occupy your hands while you're drafting that doesn't impact or distract from the other players, then why shouldn't you have access to that? So those were two really good videos. They had a really good discussion. I've also been playing a lot of World of Warcraft, so if you've been watching my channel, you would have seen there's been a few WoW videos there. It started off as I'm putting up a WoW video because some people keep asking me questions about this tank rogue I'm playing in Season of Discovery, and I'm tired of asking the same questions. And then it got 5,000 views, so I thought, hey, that's more views than I've had in a while on this channel. Let's see if I can harness that to go to another channel and make some WoW content for that. It's happening. There'll be 3 or 4 WoW videos on my channel, and then I'll go back to just Fab, and the WoW videos will be on a different channel. So just bear with me if you're wondering why is he posting WoW content. I don't really want to see that. You won't have to see it for that long. It's fine. Other news. So Heavy Hitters is obviously coming out. We've seen Kasai. I'm super excited for Kasai. She seems to be not a huge shift. Well, no, she seems to be a reasonably large shift from what she was, but not in a way that I feel detaches from the theme that she had before. So one of the things that we've been worried about recently, and I also did 2 very good videos that were reviewing what James White said during his keynote in Barcelona, and also reviewing what James, Brian, and Chris, the developer team from LSS, said during an interview with the Instant Speed podcast. Both of those shed a lot of light on what the plans are for Fab development. And one of the criticisms that I leveled against New Prism as a response to the way that they were talking about her is the problem isn't necessarily the power level of New Prism, it's the change in the playstyle of New Prism. Now today we saw the Luminaris spoiled, or depending on when this is published, we recently saw the new Luminaris spoiled that's going to give Angels and attacks go again, which does kind of bring us back to a more control style of Prism. So it'll be very interesting to see how that develops and how that rolls out, and whether she comes back into the limelight. But I think actually just the addition of that weapon might be enough to bring Prism back onto the radar. Weapons have such a huge impact in a game like Flesh and Blood. It's really amazing to think how powerful that weapon could be and how that could impact. As someone who's enjoyed playing Illusionists in the past, I am actually very excited for that, and I really can't wait to get my hands on that new weapon and also see what else is happening. I am a Guardian player. I don't like to play Warrior, I don't like to play Brute, but I do like to play Guardian, so I'm kind of excited to see what the Guardian brings. There's been a lot of speculation. Maybe we're getting Valda, maybe she's outside of Arya now, and she's roaming around just trying to make some money and have some fun in the wide world. Maybe we're going to get Yoji, who's now a bit down and out because the Emperor's dead on his watch. All these things could happen. I think it's going to be quite an interesting set. But that does bring us to an interesting discussion point, which is that the calling in Liverpool has just been announced to be a sealed calling, and the reaction is very mixed. I said during my review of Worlds that I did quite enjoy the sealed calling, but I was one of the people who was lucky enough to get to play in it. And what I mean is that for the sealed calling, people who have good decks, which I had, and people who have mid-level decks can actually have quite a fun event. Because what actually happens is you either win all of your games, bar one or two close to the end, because you have a very good deck, or you lose a game or two fairly early on, and then you play against other people who have similar decks to you. So either you're playing the best deck and you're going X and O from the start, or you're going X and 2 and still making day 2 with a medium deck, right? And then in those two brackets, the X and 2 bracket, which is still live, and the X and O bracket, you are having different, because the power levels are different, but quite fun games. This was Bright Lights, where things came down to the wire, one or two cards left in the deck, and they were actually quite enjoyable to play. The problem is, you then have the other, we'll say half of the tournament, who have mid to bad decks, right? And just don't really get out of the gate. They start off not being able to perform, they lose quickly, and the only option is to play side events. And there are pros and cons. The pros are pretty obvious. You have a new set, you don't have this before the Bright Lights, when Dash.io looked like she would be an amazing deck, when she went 14-0, the price of some of the Majestics from Bright Lights spiked to like £30 or £40 for a Majestic, not a Rainbow Foil, just a regular Majestic, stuff like Twin Drive, things like that. That was horrible. If it's a sealed, if one of the earliest events is not constructed, it's sealed, you don't have that huge rush on cards that really does affect how players can pick up their new heroes. It gives people time, people who want to play those heroes, to accumulate those cards without actually having to have that rush. So there is an argument for sealed in that regard, for just removing the rush to buy Majestics and open Majestics, which we have seen happen at Nats and at other competitive seasons when a set has come out and there's been a new meta 3 weeks later. And I feel like for a calling, that probably is a bit unfair. Like, I can understand why for a Nationals level or for a Pro Tour, it's kind of fair enough to have that expectation that these professional players are going to get the cards and you want them to have a really fresh meta going into it. But for a calling which is open entry, you don't want everyone to have to scramble for those cards. You probably do want a certain amount of people who have those cards available and can just go into a sealed without having to get those cards. So there is a valid argument for sealed in that respect. There is also a valid argument for sealed because it reduces the burden on more casual players to practice for the event, right? You can practice sealed. I did a sealed practice weekend. I did 2 of them before the Barcelona calling. It did pay off because I did make day 2, and we basically bought 2 boxes between 8 people. We took those boxes apart, packs of 6, and we built the best sealed decks we could with each pack of 6, and then all 8 of us played off each other, right? So we, played the decks, we tested our assumptions, we tested whether a pool was actually for one hero or another hero based on, whether the deck that we built worked, and we saw what the best packs and pools were out of the decks we had. So it was actually quite good practice. There was social element to it, but you do remove the constructed element of the practice, which a lot of people do enjoy before large tournaments. They enjoy getting their friends together, they enjoy building the best deck they can, tweaking it slowly, and that entire deck building process does disappear. Now, that's a lot of what the feedback on Twitter is currently saying. It's saying sealed callings are not fun for me because none of my team can practice with me and refine a deck and do all the things that we're good at. So, there is that concern of how do I, get this feeling, okay? And I think really the problem is you can't get that from a sealed event, and it does remove player agency quite a bit. So, I can understand why people are frustrated, because the maximum agency comes from having the ability to build a deck, customize it, practice it with your friends, and then you feel like you have prepared. You feel like you have done everything you can to be ready for the tournament, right or wrong. Right, some of these people, they do all this preparation, they still go 4-4, they still don't do good, but they feel like they've had agency. And I think that's the biggest risk about sealed at these large events, is that whether you have a good pool or not is determined by the cards you open. It's not determined by the agency that you have, just because you open packs. Okay, so I think that's the biggest drawback. Personally, I'm kind of fine with sealed because I don't have a huge amount of time to practice at the moment. I feel like I can learn what cards are good and bad in a limited environment, and then I do just trust my life to, whether I open good packs. And that's fine. That is fun. It genuinely is. But it is definitely causing some consternation. It is definitely causing some feedback. There have been people posting on Twitter, we'll see how real it is, that they're just not going. They're not going, their teams are dropping out. People aren't saying they're not traveling internationally for this, and I think that's the thing. I mean, it's quite a lot of money to put on low agency events. Are you going to pay £500 to travel to Liverpool for a calling to, risk opening bad cards, or are you going to just say no, thank you, we'll go for the next one? I think that's the big thing. Worlds was a special event because lots of people were always going to go to Worlds when it was in Europe, so having a sealed calling didn't really matter. If you lost, you just dropped out and did Sagrada Familia promo events, which everyone enjoyed, and there were massive crowds for, so it wasn't really as much of a risk it for a biscuit. There's a new one for the US if you haven't heard that one. Risk it for a biscuit just means, what are you willing to put on the line to get your treat, but sort of just not an all-in, if it's a calling and a standalone and the calling is sealed, it's very different from if it's Worlds and the calling is sealed. So that's a bit of a risk that people are undertaking. So that's kind of it. Yes or no? Uncertain. I think it could be a fun set. I think 6 hero sets have proven to be more fun in limited than other types of sets. But I do feel like having a sealed only calling is a pretty big risk. There are some big pros just based on when it releases, when the calling is related to the release of the show. But of the set, but it is what it is. I'm a bit concerned about it, to be honest. Other big moves, we have seen the massive change in Living Legends. So now Living Legend happens on the Monday, check, and on the Friday the cards and the hero is gone. This has led to a massive cull of Living Legend heroes. We've seen about 5 or 6 go in the past 2 weeks. I think this is overall a good thing, though people are a bit upset if their favourite hero has gone. But there have been a lot of heroes that have just been hanging on in the blitz format that wouldn't have gone for another month or two until the new set came out. So really, I think this is quite good. I think part of this is just a readjustment because we had a lot of heroes that weren't going to Living Legend, and now with the points updated and everything like that coming together, it does make it better because we're just going to get through this big cull and then it's going to calm down for a bit, and then we're going to have another cull potentially when things tick up. But, you know, there's going to be new heroes coming in that don't have any Living Legend points, and there is now going to be breathing room for them to be played. The only thing I will mention, though, which I do think is relevant, because I do think it is overall a positive for the game to have these heroes going to Living Legend, but I will say the thing I think is a negative that probably isn't as appreciated as much by people in the West is that I've been speaking to people from Vietnam and people from other areas in Asia where Blitz is the preferred format, and there are a lot of new players there who are playing with very low budgets, who've traditionally played ninjas, Ira, Kasai. They probably don't even have a full legendary suite. And those people with very low budgets, because those countries have generally a lower average income, have found that their favourite hero has gone to Living Legend and they don't have the capital to replace them with a meaningful other hero, and have been thinking about quitting the game because of that. That is quite a big downside. What I will say to those people and to those stores is that LSS is doing one thing. You do what you need to do for your community, right? If a hero is going Living Legend on Friday and 8 people in your store play Ira and they don't have the money to buy a new deck, what do? You say to those people, you can still play Ira. Okay? Or you give them a different deadline. Okay, you say to your local store, look, I know LSS and everything has Living Legended now, but we appreciate that everyone has Ira cards, so we're going to run on a different schedule. So if you're in Vietnam and you're thinking, oh, we need to stick to these serious LSS rules for our local armory nights, don't. Have a conversation with people, decide what works for you, and then just do it. And if that results in you saying, hey, actually, we're not going to Living Legend Ira for 2 months. I'm sorry, LSS, but this is just the practical way to do it, right? Here are your global rules. You know your local community. Don't exile people from the game because they don't have the money to switch heroes at this stage. It's a bit different if they've got the money to change and they don't want to, or they're in a sort of situation where they're stomping everyone with one deck every week and they just don't want to give it up. You know, those are different kind of conversations, but don't feel empowered if you're playing in like a low value area, you know, where people don't have much money to change and that kind of thing. Just don't feel like you have to force them to change straight away just because the overarching rules say that you do. Ultimately, you should be looking out for your community in whatever shape or form that takes. So I'm just going to put that out there. I do think the Living Legend changes overall for competitive Blitz are going to be fantastic. I do think it is okay if they're changing in the middle of the season. I'm kind of okay with that too. I think it will slow down. I think it will slow down a bit, and that's okay. I think we just need to get used to that. And I think that's kind of just the way that it's going to be. And I think that's okay. And I do think, in general, it will be good for the game, though it is a bit of a shell shock while we adjust to it, to this new Living Legend speed. The goal of it is okay. I wish maybe it had been 2 weeks instead of 1 week to rotate the hero. And again, I do think it does ask for a little bit of flexibility on the community if you're not playing a super serious competitive event or, you know, a skirmish or that kind of thing. Be a bit flexible, make things work for your community and the people you play with. The other announcement I just want to talk about, which I think is interesting, is just, you know, we have... I just want to talk about talents for a bit. There's a whole other video that's in the wing about this, so wait for that when it comes. But I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about talents, or the lack thereof, in recent sets, right? So talents were sold to us originally in Monarch as the new face of Flesh and Blood. So for thematic reasons, they wanted to basically make sure that every hero felt like it was from a specific place or a specific area. Talents were a way to lock cards into certain balance pools and create these mini sub-factions within each class that created these different balances. It seems to me that the general consensus is that talents didn't work as well as they were intended, and they probably aren't needed as much as they were originally thought to be. So we've seen through Outsiders and Dynasty and the latest set, Heavy Hitters, that talents have not been used recently as much as they were touted to be used previously. Previously, we got the impression from Tales of Aria and Monarch and Uprising that every hero that came now was going to be talented, and that hasn't proven to be the case. Why is this? It's because actually, when you think about it, talents more drastically restrict player creativity than perhaps they need to, right? So talents basically say this card and this card can never be played together, but actually you don't need that for the majority of Flesh and Blood. What you actually need is the ability to just design heroes that have specific effects that work with specific card pools. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the fact that you don't need a separate brute talent to silo brute cards away from Rhinar, for example, or to Rhinar from someone else, because Rhinar already has a requirement on his cards, which is that he has to play cards with 6 or more power. Similarly, in Mechanologist, we saw that talents weren't needed because Max, Tekla Vossen, and Dash all want slightly different cards. So again, we kind of see a situation where the class is what segregates different cards from each other, as well as the abilities and the requirements of those cards, making talents somewhat redundant. Now, talents are still pretty good for theme, they're still pretty good for art and for visuals, but a lot of that can be handled just through the art department rather than through other means. Now, further evidence that talents are potentially on the way out. If we look at around the table, the printed UPF set, there are a lot of cards in there that previously, based on the art, feel, and their effects, would potentially have been considered for talented cards. I'm specifically talking about the Earth buffs that we see for Guardian, which are very, very heavily keyed to the Earth element in terms of how the Guardian seems to be using their power. Now, it is worth admitting about Guardian that they are an Earth-themed class already, because a lot of their power is seen to be coming from Earthen sort of areas, and of course they have a lot of cards like, what are we thinking of? Like Pulverize and things like that, that do look like they're magical and they're Earth power attacks when they are just regular Guardian class cards. But it is kind of a bit of a departure to see these very heavily Earth-themed cards actually just on regular Guardian cards rather than on Earth Guardian cards, for example. Okay, now obviously there's a reason they're not on Earth Guardian cards, which is that Stavro is gone and Oldhim is gone, and they haven't printed a new elemental Guardian hero to replace Oldhim yet. But it is still interesting to see that these changes, to see the way the art is being used and these effects are being used outside of an elemental Guardian vibe. In addition, we have had 2 back-to-back draft sets where it seems like the draft was quite heavily enabled by the fact that none of those classes were using talents. For example, if you had a talented class in Outsiders, it would have actually drastically affected the draft, because as it was, we could easily have dual cards in the draft, which we wouldn't have been able to fit in if there was some sort of presence of a talent on one of those classes. And Heavy Hitters is likely going to follow the same pattern, which means that if Heavy Hitters and isn't a talented set and doesn't have any talents, and that becomes the ideal draft variant for Flesh and Blood because it makes the nicest draft sets, which it could very well. I think Outsiders was the best draft set we've had so far. Like, it does really just feel like it brought a lot to us in terms of flexibility of draft, skill representation in draft, and also like having multiple archetypes while also allowing for flexibility and shared cards and staying open. It feels like Outsiders really did fit the bill in that regard, and if that becomes the best way to do a draft set in Fab, we may actually quickly find that most of our draft Fab sets, of which the majority are now, do not focus on talents, and talents become a more rare and special feature used when you really, really do need to silo an effect away from other classes. Now, that's kind of an interesting point to just discuss for a minute, the siloing of effects away from other heroes of the same class, because really that is what talents are here for. Okay, talents are here for us to be able to give powerful cards to Vinset without boosting Viserai. Right, that is all. That's the only purpose that they have, is to give powerful effects to Viserai without giving powerful effects, or to Vinset without giving powerful effects to Viserai. Right, and it's kind of interesting that we may not need that as much as people think. Right, so if we look at Vinset, you could easily see an area where a lot of the cards printed for Viserai in the future are not actually that playable in Vinset. What do I mean by that? If we look at the Vinset hero text, you'll see that her ability to deal unpreventable damage hinges on the ability to play shadow non-attack actions as a source of unpreventable damage. She plays a shadow non-attack action specifically, and in doing so, she takes 1 damage to herself, which turns on a lot of her effects, and then deals unpreventable arcane damage on her first rune charm. Right, so that itself silos a lot of would-be Viserai cards away from her, but also means that there are some Viserai cards that she may actually find quite useful. And it gives the designers quite a huge tool, which is the ability to design both Runeblade class cards and also Shadow Runeblade cards with this idea of segmentation in mind. And they can look at a Runeblade class card and they can say, yes, this will be playable with Vinset. And then they can ask the question, is it too powerful in Vinset? Yes or no. Does Viserai need it? If a card is too powerful in Vinset, but Viserai needs it, then you print it as a Runeblade card. If it's too powerful in Vinset, but... So if it's just powerful in Vinset and Viserai needs it, then you can just print it as a normal Runeblade card. But if it's too powerful, then you have that option of putting the talent on. But the downside, of course, being that you're making a little silo. It is interesting now, if Heavy Hitters comes, if it doesn't have a lot of talented heroes in, we may see those sub-factions of talented heroes start to disappear and be replaced just by heroes that are defined by the text on their abilities. Dash cares about items that cost 0 or 1 or less, which means a lot of her traditional Dash, OG Dash items are actually siloed away from Dash database because she can't play them for free off the top of the deck. That's a design that's going to become more common. Talents are going to become less common because they create silos that don't give you flexibility in your choices. So that's why they're going to get rid of them. And I think there are clear indications at this stage that talents, while not a mistake, are just something that aren't needed as much as perhaps Flesh and Blood and LSS thought they were needed originally at the start of the game. So that's just interesting. It's just a design learning, I think. Originally you think, hey, we just need talents, and now you're thinking, actually, maybe we don't need talents, we just need to keep designing classes that are separate. So what does that mean? That kind of means that if we see talented heroes in the future, they will be more special cases. It also means that they probably will have simpler abilities, or abilities more focused on the talent that are more flexible to reuse the card pool of the non-talented cards for that class. And that also means that if we see heroes that are not that are not talented, it is very likely that they will have more complex abilities that are more siloed in terms of what cards actually are good for them from the class set that are available, right? So we're thinking about something like a Riptide versus a Lexi, right? Lexi is quite flexible in that she can work with any lightning or earth card, right? Whereas Riptide primarily focuses on playing traps. In essence, he is a lot more siloed in that he benefits from one type of card, less open-ended, which means there's some cards in Ranger that aren't particularly good in Riptide because of that focus on traps over anything else, which is worth thinking. We see some of that elements in Kasai as well, where she's going to have to clearly focus on card drawing at the expense of maybe other effects that other warriors are using. She also has that sort of build into a combo thing that she can do, which is probably going to push her sort of to be more defensive. But she's not immediately going to want to take all of the warrior card pool and the best cards from Dorinthia or even old Kasai and just slam them in. She might not even end up playing Blood on her hands or something like that, though I suspect she will. But you just kind of see that more complex heroes that therefore silo themselves and don't have the same level of openness, but that means that they're not talented. So you'll have more flexibility to be creative with existing hero cards, but you won't necessarily have the talented addition, right? But we'll see. This is just my theory now, based on what we're seeing with outsiders and heavy hitters, and of course, if this becomes the default for draft sets. I will say that I would expect to see another one class only draft set in the future. And just to understand my reasoning for that, this year I did a chart of the number of cards available to each hero. And one of the things that you realise when you look at, say, Arachne versus existing heroes is that it takes a bit to add a new hero to the game, right? It takes a bit of cards to get them viable. You can't just chuck them in and expect them to be working the next day. And what that kind of means is that for a new class to come in, like a brand new class, you actually might find yourself needing to give that class its own sole draft set with multiple heroes just to bring it up to the level of the other heroes in the game. So I actually think we could very much see another mono class draft set, even though from all intents and purposes what I've heard, Bright Lights was a bit of a dud. Like, a lot of people I know who were serial collectors of the game didn't actually buy a lot of it, and a lot of people were saying that it kind of missed them a bit with the theme of the cyberpunk and also with the focus on mechanologist. But I still think, even through all of that it may be in the future that the only way to add successfully a new class into the game is probably going to be by giving it its own full draft set, right, where all three of the classes are the same hero. Now, it's not the only option. We saw Assassins successfully added in with a big dump in a supplemental set, so we could see a supplemental set launch of a new class again, but I really wouldn't be surprised if we saw another mono class set that led itself into a new class coming into the game with a load of resources. And also, like, as the game grows, new classes will necessarily become less common compared to new heroes of the class, which means it will be a big event. And I think if they do add, I keep saying Druid, I'm not just coping, but if they do add like a Druid as a whole class set, I think the new excitement about that will carry through to... You know, I don't think it will just be, you know, ignored. I think if we go a year or two without a new class in the game, I think when that new class comes out, if it's given a full class set, enough people will be keen to give it a try, especially if it's something iconic like a pirate or I don't think pirate, but a druid or, you know, a necromancer or something like that. I think enough people will be keen to give it a try that it will be popular. I think one of the problems with mech is that the theme was slightly off and people aren't as keen on mech, but there are still some fantasy archetypes that people are very keen on, which if they elucidated through a whole set devoted to it, or maybe like half a set is that class and half a set is something else, then it would still make sense and be quite popular. So those are my thoughts on everything that's been happening on Flesh and Blood recently. It's the end of the episode of Steelfur Speaks. If you have enjoyed this episode, please do like and subscribe. I aim to put out an episode of Steelfur Speaks every 2 weeks, though there are bonus episodes and things when large things happen. I also do event reports from large events. I do some gameplay. I do some streaming when I have time, but I travel a lot for work, so maintaining a consistent streaming schedule is a bit difficult, unfortunately. I wish it wasn't. So I do also end up playing a lot of other games and World of Warcraft and things like that, but that will all be over on my new Steelfur Gaming channel, which I have launched recently just due to some popularity of some World of Warcraft videos that I've made. So yeah, that's going on. It's kind of fun. If you want more gaming content from me, just like general gaming content, please go over there and you can watch that. Otherwise, keep staying tuned for Steelfur Speaks for all your Flesh and Blood and broader TCG focused news.